Cracking the Code viewers, it is time for another Cracking the Code poll. We've asked you a lot of things. We've asked you about motion mechanics, how you move the pick back and forth. We've asked you about pick grip, how you hold the pick. Today, we're going to ask you perhaps the most fundamental question of all, which is, what kind of pick do you pick? What kind of pick do you use? And it's kind of weird, right? It's almost like we're going backwards. Why do we get to the most fundamental question third? Well, for me, it tends to be a very subjective question. And like many of these things that we're asking you, it's bound to be a question for which there is not necessarily a right answer. And in fact, personally, I've used every kind of guitar pick you could use. If you go back through the videos that we've made and you watch some of the old ones, you'll see every sort of pick and every sort of material, every sort of size and gauge represented there. Even beat up old dirty picks that are scratchy and worn away and they don't even have the right shape anymore. But sometimes that's what you have and you use it and it ends up sounding kind of cool. So in fact, I would say, like, whatever pick I'm using, that's the one I sort of get used to. But once in a while you go over to the jar and you grab another one out and you try it and you're like, oh, no, this one, man, now that's the pick I'm going to be using because it's different and it's exciting. You play with that for a few months and you're like, man, I'm so happy I switched to this one. This is definitely the one. And then you go over to the jar again and you pull out another one and you start playing with that and you're like, whoa, oh my God, this one, this is the one. And it just kind of flip-flops. Very impressionable that way. But to me, that just reinforces that if you have the technique, if your technique is confident, that there really isn't a right answer. And in fact, hey, maybe you should be able to use all these different picks. They're like Crayola crayons in the box, right? They're just different colors. Nevertheless, if you're a new player, it is totally reasonable. You might ask us, hey man, what kind of pick should I use? And if you don't have any preferences or you haven't played for long enough to develop any, then it would be completely reasonable for someone to want to know what pick you should use. And of course, if you're an experienced player, I still think it's, if nothing else other than a result of intellectual curiosity, you might want to know what kind of correlations are out there. Hey, what do most metal players use? What do most country players use? What kind of materials? What kind of gauges? So this is what we're trying to get at in this poll. And we're going to do it with a selection of 4 different categories or 5 different categories. First thing we're going to ask you is what size, right? Small, medium, or large. And when I think of medium, I think of, for the most part, Fender kind of being the reference point because they've been around for so long. A lot of the Fender shapes and sizes and gauges are kind of the reference points for what we think about as a standard guitar pick. So in the size category, I would say standard would be like your standard Fender kind of guitar pick, and large would be anything bigger than that. Large picks tend to have a slightly different shape, maybe more of that equilateral triangle shape like you'd find in a bass pick. And small, the iconic small pick would probably be the Jazz 3. Dunlop also has some other smaller picks that would be smaller than a sort of Fender standard there. But for the most part, we're just trying to get at, do you use the nearly ubiquitous standard Fender size pick, or do you go with the larger one or the smaller one? Now, shape is kind of a different question, although correlated. This is where we get into the general contour, right? A lot of those larger picks tend to have more of that equilateral triangle shape. Not so common on guitar, but for example, mandolin players like Andy Wood uses that blue chip CT55, the Chris Thile pick. It's got more of an equilateral shape with a little bit of a bulgy kind of, each of the sides are bowed outward a little bit. So it's got almost a kind of a rounder shape to it, but it's still triangular. That will be that kind of shape. And again, the iconic standard, let's call it Fender shape. And I would even throw something like the Jazz 3 in that category because for the most part you have the 2 sides that come to something of a point with a rounder edge opposite to that. And then you have maybe a squashed teardrop, more of an elongated or oval type shape. I think Dunlop has a few of those. Is it the Jazz 2 or Jazz 1? I forget which. It's almost like a little pebble or a bean or something. And then finally you have some round picks. You have, I think Blue Chip makes some picks that are almost the shape of a squashed penny. And that's a totally different kind of feel there. So that's the shape category. But honestly, when I think about pick shape, I'm most of the time not really so focused on the gripping area, but more the playing surface, the point of the pick. And we're going to put this as a separate category. And the 3 choices there, I feel like, are the standard Fender, where it's shaped like a point, but it's actually, if you look up closely, it's rounded over. It's not sharp. And then, of course, the iconic sharp pick, more of the Jazz 3 kind of look, where if you poke yourself with it, it's actually a point. There's actually a sharp point on the end there. And then, of course, the round point. And that could be either a rounded pick, like that squashed penny kind of design, or that could be if you take a standard a standard Fender pick and turn it around so that you play with the rounder side, now I would choose round for the point. And so this is what's cool about separating it out category-wise like this. We can capture the fact if your preference is to use a standard shaped pick, but you like to play with the rounder edge of it, then we can capture that preference in these categories. So those three questions are important. Then we get to, of course, another important question, gauge, right? What is the flexiness of the pick you choose? And to me, that's what gauge really means. Yes, there's a different feel in your hand, but to me, what really matters about gauge is what it feels like when you hit the string. You have a battle between the pick and the string, and the really thin picks, they lose that battle a little bit. They hit the string, but they also bend, flex out of the way, and that creates that flappy kind of sound. Eddie Van Halen's sort of famous for this. When you watch him do the tremolo, he uses, I don't know, 60 or something, some really thin 0.6 of a millimeter gauge. That to me is the classic or iconic thin pick sound. So I would say anything under about 0.7 of a millimeter, we'll call that thin. Fender medium gauge range, 0.7, 0.8, something like that. Basically anything under 1 millimeter, I would call that medium. The pick flexes, but not quite as much. And then Fender heavy is where you start to get to around the 1 millimeter mark, where the pick doesn't really flex that much and it starts to shove the string out of the way. And then finally 1.5, I think Fender calls that extra heavy. We can kind of create that as the upper tier for our question. And the idea there is that at that point, the pick is really not flexing much, if at all, especially depending upon the material. The pick simply might not flex and it just pushes the string out of the way. And to me, again, these 4 categories are kind of what I think about when I think about the actual attack of the pick. Leaving aside, of course, you have these very large picks, like they're almost like a golf ball or something, and you get a big gripping surface. But I think once you get above 1.5 mil, you're pretty much pushing the string out of the way, and it just feels different to do that. It is kind of the polar opposite of the Eddie Van Halen, the flappy paper kind of feeling there. So that's gauge. Now we got material, and this kind of can be like a bottomless pit of tonal preferences and questions. But if we try to boil that down to something that's a little easier to evaluate, what do we really care about with pick material? Well, for me, it's wear characteristics, principally. You have very hard materials like metal, glass, and to some extent carbon fiber, and some of the synthetic materials like blue chip material. They don't really wear away. Or if they do, it's so slow that the material for functional purposes doesn't really wear. Metal, glass, maybe, the glass in particular, maybe doesn't wear at all if it's hard enough. The next tier down from that, we would think of, again, maybe that Fender standard nylon. I think it's a nylon material that they use, where over time the pick will abrade and that playing surface will become scratchy. And if you use it long enough, eventually the shape of the pick changes to the point where it doesn't feel right anymore and you toss it. So that to me is normal pick wear, for lack of a better classification. And then soft material would be the same thing, but happens much more quickly. I would put something like Tortex maybe in that category, where you can feel that pick, the material's soft, you can really feel the string dig into the edge of it, especially as it starts to wear away and it develops that rough edge. And in fact, there's a Dunlop pick that is like a light gray material. I think it's a big stubby you can get in this light gray material that is so soft it almost feels like candle wax. And as soon as you hit the string, it starts to eat away at it right away. So I would put that as a soft material. So I think we can get by with 3 choices in this category. We can do the hard materials, the standard material, standard wear characteristics, and soft material. So with those categories, I think we capture most of it. But as far as drawing correlations, where does that come from? Well, we got to ask you what instrument you play, right? Do you play electric guitar? Do you play acoustic guitar? Or do you play mandolin? I think we can keep it to that so far. I think it captures most of our stuff. If you're an oud player, we're going to have to get back to you. Bouzouki guys, I'm sorry. Choose mandolin for now. Maybe we'll throw those in. I'll think about it when we're editing the video. And then style of music, right? I expect this is where the correlations will pop up. If you told me most aggressive metal players tend to use a similar style of physical pick, whether it's gauge or point or shape, that would not surprise me. Right away, if you meet a lot of bluegrass players, you can see that they tend to choose heavier gauge picks. And country players, I've noticed they tend to use a lot of thinner picks. I don't know why that is, but when I was down in Nashville interviewing Andy Wood and went to a couple of recording studios, they had just super flappy, almost more of the Eddie Van Halen style there. That could be a thing. But if there are preferences of this sort, we'd like to capture them. We'd like to know what they are. And I think it's useful not just for beginning players, but for everybody to learn about this stuff. Finally, at the end of the poll, we're going to give you a couple write-in boxes where for example, if there is a specific brand and model of pick that just dominates one style of music, we'd like to know that. If every metal player uses brand XYZ and gauge XYZ, then hey, that's worth knowing, right? And that data is going to be a little bit harder to tabulate since it's just text. You're just going to type it in. What's the brand? What's the model? What's the material? What's the gauge? Just type it in text. We'll look at it, and if there are salient trends that emerge there, we'll put them up on the results. But for the most part, it's going to be our usual charts. And these things, what's great about them is they're real time. You hit your answer, you come back 15 minutes, you'll see results start to pile in. And that's really, really easy to do with these multiple choice type questions. So you want to take the poll, head on over, and I should have mentioned this earlier, head on over to troygrady.com/pick, P-I-C-K, troygrady.com/pick, and take the pick choice poll. If you want to see all our polls, just head over to troygrady.com/polls, P-O-L-L-S, and we'll give you a little listing of the polls we've done so far, and you can click through to the pick choice poll from there. But I'm excited to do this. This is one of those loosey-goosey questions we get all the time, and we don't really know how to respond to it, but I think this is a great first step, and we're looking forward to seeing what happens.